Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Did I fix the audio? Do we sound decent? I don't do much live streaming because, Right. So, good to see all you guys. I appreciate you. Uh, we got a Supreme Court decision that happened, and so I'm sorry that we've been gone for a minute. It's been oh, hold on. YouTube is mad at me. Says I have to change the resolution. Whatever, I'm gonna leave it. Um, yeah, no, we've been gone. I've been traveling across the country for like the past month, and I haven't even been able to get to my office. Now that I'm here, I will say the good news: we've recorded like 20 Fuddbusters episodes because Ivan was in town, and those are all going to be coming up, getting edited soon, and then we'll have a This Week in Guns this week. But I think we've got something else to talk about right now, right? We want to talk about this case. So, and I guess you guys will see when I don't have the opportunity to edit the video, I have really terrible Shatner-esque pauses, so I'm sorry about that. So, the Cargil case is really interesting. This is damn it! I'm such a bad streamer. Probably because of my lack of. Sorry, I'll fix the sound. Oh my god, that was so stupid. What was the last thing you guys heard me say before I clipped over? All right, guys. Well, this should do it. So yeah, the thing that's really interesting about this case is that when the bump stock ban first happened, the gun rights groups and well, that's who it was, were bringing like really weak, terrible cases. They all focused exclusively, not even on, hey, this doesn't meet the definition of the statute, but it was more like, you should have did the wall again. You should have let us commenting more. You didn't follow the procedures, right? And it was actually me and Joe Greenlee wrote an amicus brief in one of these cases that were like, hey, by the way, on top of all that, it doesn't even meet the statutory definition. And then, by the way, we got screamed at for that. We got screamed at for that, especially by, and I think now is a great time for me to publicly call out Eric Jaffe, who's FPC's favorite lawyer, told us that we were idiots, that we were jeopardizing the existing litigation, and that, you know, that is what the statute says. Well, then look what happened. Look what happened. So the Cargil case was the first one to just straight up, open and out say, hey, this thing's not a machine gun. Period. End of story. So how did that go, right? At first, the Fifth Circuit was like, hey, hold on, you're right. And then it was like, oh, hold on, let's not get too spicy about this, and, backed off. And then, and it kind of went back and forth. And then, en banc, they were like, no, this actually isn't a machine gun. And the Attorney General's office, or Solicitor General's office, whatever, specifically requested that the case be heard by the Supreme Court. Okay? That was not a pro-gamer move. Because there's two instances where the Supreme Court, really often picks up a case. Those are, one, when there is a massive split between the circuits, right? All the circuit, the first through fifth circuits are saying the sky's blue, and the rest of the circuits are saying it's red, right? That's where they really step in to resolve it. And also, when the federal government requests it. So, what we have to understand here is that the feds were basically like, come here, get them, right? and they rolled the dice. So let's see how that dice roll went out. So before we start reading the opinion, most of you who are here, because, my audience is pretty good at being gun smart, right? Know what a bump stock is. But just for completion's sake, let's take a step back and say, well, what is a bump stock? A long time ago, there was the Aikens accelerator device, and that went on a 1022. And what the Aikens accelerator was a very bad quality stock. And I say it's a bad quality stock because it allowed the rifle to move back and forth in the chassis with a spring at the back of it. And so you'd pull the trigger and the gun would recoil against the spring, and then it would come back against your finger. And so that was the operations of the Aikens accelerator. And they sold this for a while, and then ATF was like, hey, that's a mushy go gun. That's a mushy go gun. You can't do that. And so they're like, okay, well, how do we fix it? Because we've got all these machine guns, right? How do we make them not machine guns? And ATF's like, take the spring out. Right? So that's literally, so ATF created the bump stock in the first instance by doing that. And then other companies finally were like, oh, hey, if we take the spring out, we can just make it bump against our finger. And that's whatever. So fast forward to the Las Vegas shooting, right, where a lot of people died. A bump stock was used. I don't want to hear any conspiracy theories saying that it was actually a 240 or, that type of nonsense. That's complete nonsense. When you listen to the sinusoidal wave of when it goes off, if you have any experience with the firearms, it's very obvious it was a bump stock. Congress, 3 different times, was like, let's do the ban, and they didn't, right? They couldn't pull it together. So it is what it is. But then Donald Trump was like, I'll show you. And directed the ATF to do something about it. And, that's how we got here. The ATF, at the direction of the president, which is super shocking, super concerning, especially now when the administrative agencies, you have to remember, do not have the ability, the authority. Well, ability is a strong way of putting it, right? They do not have the authority to make law. By the way, is the stream quality good enough for you guys? You can read the text on the screen all right, and all right, cool. I was just checking because this screen is beeping at me. I'm gonna put it over here. It's like I'm trying to belly land a 737, so I'm just gonna get it out of my eye. So God, what was I just saying? Oh, right. the largest area of compliance, right, that's developing is administrative compliance. This is despite the fact that administrative agencies are only able to interpret existing law and not make new law. Then how does it follow that the vast majority of compliance costs imposed are in the administrative area? Well, it doesn't, not legally anyway. And so the Supreme Court has long been trying to claw back at that. Under that entire backdrop, I do think it's kind of hilarious that this administration actually asked for this. But anyway, let's drive into the opinion, unless any of you guys have any questions or if there's any other preliminary stuff that you think we should cover before we start reading it. What I was planning to do is read the decision, and then whenever there's something that I think is precedential, something that I think will have an impact later on, something that might have suspicious reasoning, stop and kind of talk about it. How does that sound to you guys? All right, cool. Well, Yakub Runyon Fisher, you can send me some money in an email if you want me to spot check arguments you're preparing for lawsuits. But all right, let's get into this. I should do a collab with Othias to do a video on the Draco. That sounds nice. The Draco is good. Oh, look at this nice little Draco art somebody gave me. This is a gentleman from the AK Kings of Detroit who I went and met. Gave me this fine Draco art, and he's also a new lawyer. So thanks to you and whatever. Dracos are good. So let's get into this. So everything, all of you guys can read the syllabus, right? The syllabus is what covers it's like the condensed summary of the whole opinion. So we're just going to blast through that real quick just because it does get to the meat of it really fast. But the real meat and potatoes starts here, the actual opinion of the court. That's where we see the actual argumentation. That's where we see the actual reasoning. You're not going to see like analogical reasoning up in the syllabus. But let's just blast through the syllabus real quick. The National Firearms Act of 1934 defines a machine gun as any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can readily be restored to shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. With a machine gun, a shooter can fire multiple times or even continuously by engaging the trigger only once. This capability distinguishes a machine gun from a semi-automatic firearm. With a semi-automatic firearm, the shooter can fire only one time by engaging the trigger. Using a technique called bump firing, shooters can fire semi-automatic firearms at rates approaching those of some machine guns. A shooter who bump fires a rifle uses the firearm's recoil to help rapidly manipulate the trigger. Although bump firing does not require any additional equipment, a bump stock is an accessory designed to make the technique easier. A bump stock does not alter the basic mechanics of bump firing, and the trigger still must be released and re-engaged to fire each additional shot. For many years, the ATF consistently took the position that semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks were not machine guns under 5845B. ATF abruptly changed course when a gunman using semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks fired hundreds of rounds into a crowd in Las Vegas, killing 58 people and wounding over 500 more. ATF subsequently proposed a rule that would repudiate its previous guidance and amend its regulations to clarify, and like scare quotes there are good, that bump stocks are machine guns. ATF's rule ordered owners of bump stocks either to destroy or surrender them to ATF to avoid criminal prosecution. Michael Cargil surrendered 2 bump stocks to ATF under protest, then filed suit to challenge the rule under the Administrative Procedure Act. As relevant, Cargil alleged that ATF lacked statutory authority to promulgate the rule because bump stocks are not machine guns as defined in 5845B. After a bench trial, the district court entered judgment for ATF. The Fifth Circuit initially affirmed, but reversed after rehearing en banc. A majority agreed that 5845B is ambiguous as to whether a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock fits the statutory definition of a machine gun, and resolved that ambiguity in Cargil's favor. So, holding, ATF exceeded its authority by issuing a rule that classifies a bump stock as a machine gun under 5845B. A rifle. So, and this is all of the sub reasoning for that core holding. Let me just check the chat. Boop. Fire. Lol. I too read things that agree with me. So yeah. So now the subpoints of the holding. So right, this is all relating to ATF has exceeded its authority in promulgating the bump stock rule. A semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun as defined by 5845B because 1, it cannot fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, and 2, even if it could, it would not do so automatically. ATF therefore exceeded its statutory authority by issuing a rule that classifies bump stocks as machine guns. This is going to be a really interesting part of the opinion because I expect that this will have significant impacts on products going down the line. What they've done here is the opposite of what the government was hoping they would do. And they've separated out, as the statute is actually written, right, the function of the trigger and the mechanism, the self-actuating and regulating mechanism. So that's important, and I think this might pave the way forward for a lot of products that are not, not machine guns. But the way we analyze those, we still have to be just as careful. Remember, the ATF is... there's a lot of stuff that can be done years after you got in trouble, right? But they can still ruin your life pretty well. But yeah, we'll talk about all that once we get down to that area. Yeah, Fuddbusters looks to me like Thomas left room open to rule against FRT trigger types. We'll talk about that. And as we read that, we'll take the FRT and keep it in mind. Okay. Pretty much assume Roberts always sides with liberal judges at this point. Well, Roberts is a cop. So anyway, let's move on. B, a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The phrase function of the trigger refers to the mode of action by which the trigger activates the firing mechanism. No one disputes that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock is not a machine gun because the shooter must release and reset the trigger between every shot. Any subsequent shot fired after the trigger has been released and reset is the result of a separate and distinct function of the trigger. Nothing changes when a semi-automatic rifle is equipped with a bump stock. Between every shot, the shooter must release pressure from the trigger and allow it to reset before re-engaging the trigger for another shot. Bump stock merely reduces the amount of time that elapses between separate functions of the trigger. And so I see this is where a lot of you guys are getting your FRT concern for them, but remember, this is the syllabus. So we have to go into the actual reasoning to understand it better. And Brandon H.A. thinks that binary triggers might now be in peril. I don't think that's what this says. And we'll talk about that. So ATF argues that a shooter using a bump stock must pull the trigger only one time to initiate a bump firing sequence of multiple shots. This initial trigger pull sets off a sequence, fire, recoil, bump, fire, that allows the weapon to continue firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. This argument rests on the mistaken premise that there is a difference between the shooter flexing his finger to pull the trigger and pushing the firearm forward to bump the trigger against the stationary finger. So that's important, right? That's the court saying, at least here in the syllabus, that's the court saying the function of the trigger is observed independently of the shooter. Right. Moreover, ATF's position is logically inconsistent because its reasoning would also mean that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock is capable of firing more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Yet ATF agrees that is not the case. ATF's argument is thus at odds with itself, which is often what happens here. Right. So C, even if a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock could fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, it would still not do so automatically. 5845B specifies the precise action that must automatically cause a weapon to fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. That is the precise action. The more than one shot must come by a single function of the triggers. This is where I'm talking about it being bifurcated, right? If something more than a single function of the trigger is required to fire multiple shots, the weapon does not satisfy the statutory definition. Firing multiple shots using a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock requires more than a single function of the trigger. The shooter must maintain forward pressure on the rifle's front grip with his non-trigger hand. Without this ongoing manual input, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock will not fire multiple shots. ATF counters that machine guns also require continuous manual input from a shooter. The shooter must both engage the trigger and keep it pressed down to continue shooting. ATF argues there is no meaningful difference between holding down the trigger of a traditional machine gun and maintaining forward pressure on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock. This argument ignores that Congress defined a machine gun by what happens automatically by a single function of the trigger. Simply pressing and holding the trigger down on a fully automatic rifle is not manual input in addition to a trigger's function. By contrast, pushing forward on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not part of functioning the trigger. Sorry to break. Okay. Will this be archived? I don't know, probably. This is an interesting point that came up with the syllabus that I like. Moreover, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock is indistinguishable from the Ithaca Model Cert 37 shotgun, a weapon the ATF concedes cannot fire multiple shots automatically. ATF responds that a shooter is less physically involved with operating the bump stock equipped rifle than operating the Model 37. It explains that once a shooter pulls the rifle's trigger a single time, the bump stock harnesses the firearm's recoil energy in a continuous back and forth cycle that allows the shooter to attain continuous firing. But even if one aspect of a weapon's operation could be seen as automatic, that would not mean the weapon shoots automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. So this is going to be an interesting thing, and we'll talk about when we get down there. I think that what happened in some of the briefing was people were talking about like slam fire firearms and how that they effectively have a autosear. But this, I think that might not be a good analogy, and we'll talk about that when we get down there, because there's a separate part of the definition without manual reloading, and so if you're manually reloading a repeating firearm, that being not a self-loading firearm, it can't be a machine gun, and we've thought about ways to kind of mess with that point in the law, right, by having a button that initiates the reloading cycle. But anyway, we'll see. So yeah, abandoning the text. ATF attempts to shore up its position by relying on the presumption against ineffectiveness. This is one of the stupid. So that presumption weighs against interpretations of a statute that would render the law in great measure nugatory and enable offenders to elude its provisions in the most easy manner. So they're basically saying if we can't redefine machine guns at whim to cover whatever the president asks, the whole statute is worthless. Well, I mean, the whole statute is worthless, but anyway. So in ATF's view, Congress restricted machine guns because they eliminate the manual movements that a shooter would otherwise need to make in order to fire continuously at a high rate of fire, as bump stocks do. That is not in the congressional record, by the way. So ATF reasons, concluding bump stocks are lawful simply because the trigger moves back and forth, would exalt artifice above reality and enable evasion of the federal machine gun ban. The presumption against ineffectiveness cannot work the way that ATF asks of it. Interpreting 5845B to exclude semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks comes nowhere close to making the statute useless. So they affirmed the decision of the en banc Fifth Circuit. Justice Thomas delivered the opinion of the court, which Roberts and Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett joined. Alito filed a concurrence, and Sotomayor fired a dissenting opinion in which Kagan and Jackson, quelle surprise, joined. We got 2 super chats before we start the main argument. Dangerous Freedom says, the only commentator I trust. That's a mistake. You shouldn't trust me. Fair Frozen says, machine guns are cool. I also want a bumpy dumpy stick. I mean, I guess. Whatever you want, man. I'm all for whatever makes you happy. I got a bug. Damn it. Got him. Okay. It's a bug on the wall. It's one of the pleasures of living in Florida. If you don't have bugs, you have rats. Price? Okay. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to take a little drink, and we will read the main opinion. I'm back. I think Ivan is I think he's being a big workman. I think he can't. He was commenting though. So Ivan, if you want to come on, you can. But oh, Cody C, thank you for your first ever super chat on a live stream. That tells me that you have not been subject to the VTuber menace. Dobby with a throbby, seeing ATF get slapped in court has me bricked up right now. That's good. Bill Lozier, did you crump when you read this? Oh, hold on, is that your first super chat too? Yeah, crazy. Well, happy birthday or whatever. That's funny. If you don't have bugs, you have rats. That explains Ivan. That's true. All right, we're going to move on. Okay. So this is the opinion of the court, the controlling part of the opinion, in which, let's just make sure there's no plurality bullshit. Yeah, Thomas, Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett. Yep, that's controlling opinion. There's not going to be any nonsense. Sometimes when you have plurality opinions, there's weird crap going on. Okay, that's sorry. Congress has long restricted. Oh no, I don't like that. Oh, let's read it. Justice Thomas. Congress has long restricted access to machine guns, a category of firearms defined by the ability to shoot automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Semi-automatic firearms, which require shooters to re-engage the trigger for every shot, are not machine guns. This case asks whether a bump stock, an accessory for a semi-automatic rifle that allows the shooter to rapidly engage the trigger and therefore achieve a high rate of fire, converts the rifle into a machine gun. We hold it does not, and therefore affirm. The only reason I kind of got spooked at that is because of the word long, but I mean, of course, this isn't he's not saying it's long standing, right? He's just saying it has been a while, right? So, whatever. It's been just because it has long done something doesn't mean the prohibition is long standing in a constitutional context. Under the National Firearms Act of 1934, a machine gun is any weapon which shoots, is designed to shoot, or can be readily restored to shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. Statutory definition also includes any part designed and intended for use in converting a weapon into a machine gun. With a machine gun, a shooter can fire multiple times or even continuously by engaging the trigger only once. This capability distinguishes a machine gun from a semi-automatic firearm. With a semi-automatic firearm, the shooter can fire only one time by engaging the trigger. The shooter must release and re-engage the trigger to fire another shot. Machine guns can ordinarily achieve higher rates of fire than semi-automatic firearms because the shooter does not need to release and re-engage the trigger between shots. Shooters have devised techniques for firing semi-automatic firearms at rates approaching those of some machine guns. One technique is called bump firing. A shooter who bump fires a rifle using the firearm's recoil to help rapidly manipulate the trigger. Shooter allows the recoil from one shot to push the whole firearm backward. As the rifle slides back and away from the shooter's stationary trigger finger, the trigger is released and reset for the next shot. Simultaneously, the shooter uses his non-trigger hand to maintain forward pressure on the rifle's front grip. The forward pressure counteracts the recoil and causes the firearm, and thus the trigger, to move forward and bump into the shooter's trigger finger. This bump re-engages the trigger and causes another shot to fire, and so on. Bump firing is a balancing act. The shooter must maintain enough forward pressure to ensure that he will bump the trigger with sufficient force to engage it. But if the shooter applies too much forward pressure, the rifle will not slide back far enough to allow the trigger to reset. The right balance produces a reciprocating motion that permits the shooter to repeatedly engage and release the trigger in rapid succession. Although bump firing does not require any additional equipment, there are accessories designed to make the technique easier. A bump stock is one such accessory. It replaces a semi-automatic rifle stock, the back part of the rifle that rests against the shooter's shoulder, with a plastic casing that allows every other part of the rifle to slide back and forth. This casing helps manage the back and forth motion required for bump firing. A bump stock also has a ledge to keep the shooter's trigger finger stationary. A bump stock does not alter the basic mechanics of bump firing. As with any semi-automatic firearm, the trigger still must be released and re-engaged to fire each additional shot. The question in this case is whether a bump stock transforms a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun as defined by 5845B. For many years, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosive took the position that semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks were not machine guns under the statute. On more than 10 separate occasions under several administrations, ATF consistently concluded that rifles equipped with bump stocks cannot automatically fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. For example, ATF explained that a rifle equipped with a bump stock does not operate automatically because forward pressure must be applied with the support hand to the forward handguard. And because the shooter slides the rifle forward in the stock to fire each shot, each succeeding shot fires with a single trigger function. ATF abruptly reversed course in response to a mass shooting in Las Vegas, Nevada. In October 2017, a gunman fired on a crowd attending an outdoor music festival in Las Vegas, killing 58 people and wounding over 500 more. The gunman equipped his weapons with bump stocks, which allowed him to fire hundreds of rounds in a matter of minutes. This tragedy created tremendous political pressure to outlaw bump stocks nationwide. Within days, members of Congress proposed bills to ban bump stocks and other devices designed to accelerate the rate of fire of a semi-automatic rifle. None of these bills became law. Similar proposals in the intervening years have also stalled. While the first wave of bills was pending, ATF began considering whether to reinterpret 5845B's definition of machine gun to include bump stocks. It proposed a rule that would amend its regulations to clarify that bump stocks are machine guns. ATF's about-face drew criticism from some observers, including those who agreed that bump stocks should be banned. Senator Dianne Feinstein, for example, warned that ATF lacked statutory authority to prohibit bump stocks, explaining that the proposed regulation hinged on a dubious analysis and that the gun lobby and manufacturers would have a field day with ATF's reasoning in court. She asserted that legislation is the only way to ban bump stocks. ATF issued its final rule in 2018. The agency's earlier regulations simply restated 5845B's statutory definition. The final rule amended those regulations by adding the following language. And here we get the real nonsense. The term semi-automatically, as it modifies shoots, is designed to shoot or can be readily restored to shoot, means functioning as the result of a self-acting or self-regulating mechanism that allows the firing of multiple rounds through a single function of the trigger. And single function of the trigger means a single pull of the trigger and analogous motions. The term machine gun includes a bump stock type device, i.e. a device that allows a semi-automatic firearm to shoot more than one shot with a single pull of the trigger by harnessing the recoil energy of the semi-automatic firearm to which it is affixed so that the trigger resets and continues firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. Yeah, no, it didn't say it. It said automatically. Sorry, I misspoke. But yeah, like that's not a clarifying amendment, I don't think. Sorry, Geode KYT says something interesting, and we will take a look. We will take a look at that. The final rule also repudiated ATF's previous guidance that bump stocks did not qualify as machine guns under 5845B. and it ordered owners of bump stocks to destroy them or surrender them to ATF within 90 days. Bump stock owners who failed to comply would be subject to criminal prosecution. Michael Cargil surrendered 2 bump stocks to ATF under protest. He then filed suit to challenge the final rule, asserting a claim under the Administrative Procedure Act. As relevant, Cargil alleged that ATF lacks statutory authority to promulgate the final rule because bump stocks are not machine guns as defined in 5845B. After a bench trial, the district court entered judgment for ATF. The court concluded that a bump stock fits the statutory definition of a machine gun. The Court of Appeals initially affirmed, but later reversed after rehearing en banc. A majority agreed, at a minimum, that 5845B is ambiguous as to whether a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock fits the statutory definition of a machine gun, and the majority concluded that the rule of lenity required resolving the ambiguity in Cargil's favor. An 8-judge plurality determined that the statutory definition of machine gun unambiguously excludes such weapons. A semi-automatic rifle equipped with bump stock, the plurality reasoned, fires only one shot each time the trigger acts, and so does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The plurality also concluded that a bump stock does not enable a semi-automatic rifle to fire more than one shot automatically because the shooter must maintain manual forward pressure on the barrel. So, Mark, I'm having a field day with ATF's reasoning in court. That's funny. I like that. Boop. So, let's talk about this reasoning for just a second. And what this might mean. Right, because I had a call with one of my clients this morning. They asked if this had an impact, and I was like, I think it does. And so the thing here, like what do we think might be relevant to the Hoover case and the Adamiak case, and the other cases of people like being banged up over shit that is not a machine gun or is not ambiguously a machine gun, is the Supreme Court recognizing the rule of lenity's application in something that is not like a grievous statutory ambiguity necessarily, but like an ambiguity as to whether the statute covers the ultimate conduct. So it's important to just see that recognized at the High Court. We granted certiorari to address a split among the Court of Appeals regarding whether bump stock meets 5845B's definition of machine gun. We now affirm. And so we'll get into section 2 of the analysis, and I'll read these chats before we start. You already got you, Mark. With the ubiquity of switches and other such items, it just seems so silly that the ATF/Gov gets their panties in a wad over silly bumpy stocks. Well, so what's the alternative, right? Them being like chill about stuff that's like vague edge cases, and then we only have to battle on ground that like the public perception is against. So I actually think that stuff like this, like I think that this is a massive unforced error on the part of ATF, and I think that the result may be shifting the Overton window so that then maybe 5-10 years down the line we can attack, or even sooner, who knows, we can successfully attack the meat of the issue, the thing that we really want to get at, which is the statute itself, the regulations themselves. Potentially criminal says, hooray, we can keep our bussin' stonks. Sorry, phone's blowing off, as you might be able to assume. 68 Attacked Sub says, my grandfather was a B-17 tail gunner in World War II, and he passed away this week. Rip Corporal E.T. Flood, and bless you for your service. Paul Wozmek, good work as always. Matt, thank you, Paul. And Bruni says, why is nobody fighting for a constitutional right to self-defense? What good is having all the guns you can afford if you can be sent to prison for using those guns to defend you and your family? I don't think that's... I don't know about that. And Geode, I don't know, man. I don't know if I agree with you. I think Geode says, I don't think we'll succeed in a facial challenge to NFA overall, but I think 922.0 is vulnerable. I think, I don't know. I think the whole thing's unconstitutional. I think 922.0 is more vulnerable, especially from like, a tax law standpoint, because that, and also it's, like, I certainly agree that 922.0 is more vulnerable. That being 922.0 being the tack on that made it impossible to register more machine guns. The question is, like, is it constitutionally permissible to support the taxing and registration of certain weapons? Like, you have to view that in a vacuum, right? Apart from like an outright ban. All right, so let's. Oh, okay. Hold on. Give me 1 second, guys. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. I did just learn some funny things about Cargil. Like, the person. Whatever. Is that what that is? Is that Flow Pen? I don't know. Guy just gave it to me. It was nice. Okay. That's funny. No, always target Fido did not kick in the door. I'm fine. Thank you, guys. All right, let's go. So section 2. Section 5845B defines machine gun as any weapon which is capable of firing automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Oh, hold on. This nice reporter man is asking for the live stream link. I think it's this. So, right. I think we'll be hearing, like, probably till we're sick of reading it. Uncle Joe, what does this mean for super safeties? I don't know. We haven't read the whole opinion yet. 5845B defines a machine gun as any weapon capable of firing automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. We hold that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun because it cannot fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, and even if it could, it would not do so automatically. I think we're going to be hearing like a lot of that. ATF therefore exceeded its statutory authority by issuing a rule that classifies bump stocks as machine guns. The semi-automatic rifle, okay, literally just say that. Any subsequent shot fired after the trigger has been released and reset is a result of separate and distinct functions of the trigger. All that a bump stock does is accelerate the rate of fire caused by this distinct functions of the trigger to occur in rapid succession. The question is really of whether it actually does increase the rate of fire, and I don't think it mechanically does. As always, we start with the statutory text. It refers to a single function of the trigger. The function of an object is the mode of action by which it fulfills its purpose. So that's like we're having to, because the ATF has played such absurd games, we're having to nail down each individual little element here of the definition. So the function of an object is the mode of action by which it fulfills its purpose. That's referred to in the dictionary, right? And a trigger is an apparatus such as a movable catch or lever that sets some force or mechanism in action. The lever pressed by the finger to discharge a firearm, any similar device used to release or activate a mechanism. So, like, yeah, we've got like a ton of of definitions. This whole section is just dictionary definitions of trigger and function. And, you know, that winds up being necessary when the government so forcefully argues that, no one knows what these terms are, and we need to make up, like, whole massive paragraphs about them. Right. So, the phrase function of the trigger thus refers to the mode of action by which the trigger activates the firing mechanism. For most firearms, including ones at issue here, the trigger is a curved metal lever. On weapons, yeah, that's right, Thomas. Get those straight trigger boys out of here. The phrase function of the trigger means the physical trigger movement required to shoot the firearm. No one disputes that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock is not a machine gun. Because it only fires one shot per function of the trigger. That is, engaging the trigger a single time will cause the firing mechanism to discharge only one shot. To understand why, it is helpful to consider the mechanics of the firing cycle for a semi-automatic rifle, because the statutory definition is keyed to a function of the trigger. Only the trigger assembly is relevant for our purposes. Although trigger assemblies for semi-automatic rifles vary, the basic mechanics are generally the same. The following series of illustration depicts how the trigger assembly on an AR-15 style semi-automatic rifle works. In each illustration, the front of the rifle, the barrel, would be pointing to the left. I had those fucking images made. Those were in that brief I was talking to you guys about. And whenever FPC ultimately like claims some sort of credit for this, I hope they remember that they screamed at me and Joe for doing this independently and not asking permission. And now look what happened. We were right. By the way, Joe's at the NRA now. Tells you how shitty FPC is. We had those done way back in 2019. The trigger is a simple lever that moves backward and forward. The square point at the top left edge of the trigger locks into a notch at the bottom of the hammer. The hammer is a spring-loaded part that swings forward toward the barrel and strikes the firing pin, causing a shot to fire. The disconnector is the component responsible for resetting the hammer to its original position after a shot is fired. We turn next to how these components operate. God, I love seeing this. When the shooter engages the trigger by moving it backward, as indicated by the arrow, the square point of the trigger pivots downward and out of the notch securing the hammer. The movement releases the spring-loaded hammer, allowing it to swing forward. At the top of the hammer's rotation, it strikes the firing pin, causing the weapon to fire a single shot. I'm sorry, I'm getting preemptively angry because I know that the FPC orgs are going to take credit for that. But the brief that they filed was literally an edited version of the one that me and Joe did that they screeched at us over, saying we ruined everything. And now here, the fucking explanation we wrote and the pictures that I commissioned, like specifically, I know the artist that. Anyway, I just can't wait. If they do take credit for it, guess what? I'm telling on them. Anyway, Firearm then ejects the spent cartridge from the chamber and loads a new one in its place. The mechanism that performs this task swings the hammer backward at the same time. As the hammer swings backward, it latches onto the disconnector. This latch prevents the hammer from swinging forward again after a new cartridge is loaded into the chamber. The disconnector will hold the hammer in that position for as long as the shooter holds the trigger back, thus preventing the firearm from firing another shot. Finally, when the shooter takes pressure off the trigger and allows it to move forward, as indicated by the arrow, the hammer slips off the disconnector just as the square point of the trigger rises to the notch of the hammer. The trigger mechanism is thereby reset to the original position shown in Figure 1. Semi-automatic rifle must complete the cycle for each shot fired. Yeah, I love the animated graphic that displays the relevant movement is available. So like the Supreme Court, and we also know the guy who made the GIF that the Supreme Court now has on their website, which I just love. I just think this is so fun. They kind of, I don't want to hear it. Oh, they already have? FEC's already claimed credit? Don't worry, I'll tell. I'm telling on them. You shit lips told me and Joe, like, and had Eric Jaffe, your little pet white shoe, know nothing, never shot a gun little lawyer, that we were ruining everything by making these drawings and explaining the way the trigger functions and how the rule doesn't actually, implicate the affected items. That we were jeopardizing your lawsuit, which, by the way, failed. That's not the one that fucking went up, is it? And so yeah, the brief that was cited was written by two people who conspicuously no longer work there because we hate you. And now you're taking and the language in it you screeched at because none of you are even are a bunch of know nothing, no guns, little grift lords. Hate it. Anyway, ATF does not dispute that the complete process is what constitutes the single function of the trigger. A shooter may fire the weapon again after the trigger has reset, but only by engaging the trigger a second time and thereby initiating a new firing cycle. For each shot, the shooter must engage the trigger, then release the trigger to allow it to reset. Any additional shot fired after one cycle is the result of a separate and distinct function of the trigger. Nothing changes when a semi-automatic rifle is equipped with a bump stock. The firing cycle remains the same. Between every shot, the shooter must release pressure from the trigger and allow it to reset before re-engaging the trigger for another shot. A bump stock merely reduces the amount of time that elapses between separate functions of the trigger. The bump stock makes it easier for the shooter to move the firearm back forward toward his shoulder, thereby release pressure from the trigger and reset it. And it helps the shooter press the trigger against his finger very quickly thereafter. A bump stock does not convert a semi-automatic rifle into a machine gun any more than a shooter with a lightning-fast trigger finger does. Even with a bump stock, a semi-automatic rifle will fire only one shot for every function of the trigger, so a bump stock cannot qualify as a machine gun under 5845B's definition. Although ATF agrees on a semi-automatic rifle's mechanics, it nevertheless insists that a bump stock allows a semi-automatic rifle to fire multiple shots by a single function of the trigger. And of course it insists that because it knows that that's like, it has no objective hook in the statute. Bitfreakazoid, what do you mean inter-lawyer? They don't have any lawyers. There's no inter-lawyer drama. Except, I guess, Jaffe. Yeah, I hate him too. Although ATF agrees that on a semi-automatic rifle's mechanics, which, by the way, they don't actually employ. They pay him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars per hour because the president of FPC has a weird protosexual fixation with white shoe lawyers. Anyway, although ATF agrees on a semi-automatic rifle's mechanics, it nevertheless insists that a bump stock allows a semi-automatic rifle to fire multiple shots by a single function of the trigger. ATF starts by interpreting the phrase single function of the trigger to mean a single pull of the trigger and analogous motions, which is not in the statute. A shooter using a bump stock, it asserts, must pull the trigger only one time to initiate a bump firing sequence of multiple shots. This initial trigger pull sets off a sequence, fire, recoil, bump, fire, that allows the weapon to continue firing without additional physical manipulation of the trigger by the shooter. According to ATF, all the shooter must do is keep his trigger finger stationary on the bump stock's ledge and maintain constant forward pressure on the front grip to continue firing. The dissent offers similar reasoning, which, of course it does. They basically just copy-pasted it. Yeah, Greg Johnson. This argument rests on the mistaken premises that there is a difference between a shooter flexing his trigger to pull the trigger and a shooter pushing the firearm forward to bump the trigger against a stationary figure. So that's the court specifically saying, that what the shooter is doing, the perspective of the shooter, has no impact on the functioning of the trigger. Right? ATF and the dissent seek to call the shooter's initial trigger pull a function of the trigger while ignoring the subsequent bumps of the shooter's finger against the trigger before every additional shot. But 5845B does not define a machine gun based on what type of human input engages the trigger, whether it be a pull, bump, or something else. Right? So this is where, because we have release triggers have always existed, and then of course the the binary is where you guys are going to be worried about that. So we don't have enough information to reverse, and frankly, any reasoning we apply to binary triggers will be reading the tea leaves. It's just not in here because it's not before the court, but we'll try to reverse engineer it from this the logic that we see here. So put a pin in the or something else language. Nor does it define a machine gun based on whether the shooter has assistance engaging the trigger. The statutory definition instead hinges on how many shots discharge when the shooter engages the trigger. And, as we have explained, a semi-automatic rifle will fire only one shot each time the shooter engages the trigger, with or without a bump stock. In any event, ATF's argument cannot succeed on its own terms. The final rule defines function of the trigger to include not only a single pull of the trigger, but also any analogous motions. ATF concedes that one such analogous motion that qualifies as a single function of the trigger is sliding the rifle forward to bump the trigger. How is that analogous? Well, I guess that's the point. Oh, okay. Sorry, we got a good friend who's asking a question, and let me just switch off to here. Doop. So the question is, does this case have broader implications beyond bump stocks to regulation of other things like auto sears or so-called ghost guns? So that's actually a really interesting point that we are going to be. I'm not ready to. No, I'm out of focus. I'm not ready to make that call just yet because we haven't gotten the core elements of the decision yet. We're still, it would still be very premature because we're still reading through the whole thing, right? This thing just dropped, to apply this to something outside of the non-machine gun context, right? So you're specifically asking about auto sears. To an auto sear, I'm not sure this case has any precedent, and I'll go ahead and guess that it won't. To ghost guns, though, I think that it will, right? Because what this case is about isn't so much about the definition of machine gun, but it's about how far outside of the lines that the Supreme Court is willing to allow regulatory agencies to draw. And I think what this case is saying is not very far. So what's the meaning there is that, well, we're stuck with the statutory language. And I don't think that's a flaw. In fact, I think that's how our system was intended to work. So do I think this will have impacts on other non-machine gun device going? And I use that right because it's not a good definition, but Do I think this decision will have impacts on things like binary triggers, on things like force reset triggers? I do think it will. Do I think that this case will have an impact on a Glock switch? No, not in the short term anyway. Do I think it'll have an impact on ghost guns? Probably, because as we've already seen, the ATF is losing those cases on the grounds that the law doesn't define, frame or receiver of a firearm or some precursor part to a frame or receiver. That's the ATF, in attempting to regulate ghost guns, basically did that. They redefined frame or receiver to include something that isn't, but might one day be or currently resembles. That's not really a question of the immediate Supreme Court case, right? That's a question of, does it say that in the statute? But that's what this case is really all about. And I think this case is saying, hey, ATF, the statute says, and we've read it like 20 times, fires automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. You can't take that little sentence and clarify it by adding several pages. Regulations have to be clarifying. They can't inject more ambiguity. And in the case of the ghost guns rulings, they absolutely injected more ambiguity. In the case of the bump stock rulings, I'm not sure if they injected more ambiguity, right? The rulings were a little bit different. But they defined very specifically something that wasn't covered by the statutory text. So, to answer your question, yes, it will have serious implications in regulation in general. In fact, this case, as we're reading it, is kind of significantly impacting the way Chevron deference had worked. Because we're holding them pretty strictly to the words of the statute now, which is a good thing. That'll mean stuff for Waters of the United States cases. That'll mean stuff for EPA cases. That will mean just for the broader regulatory environment, it means that they're going to be, the bounds of their playpen will be more clearly defined. And I think that's a good thing for everyone. And also, yeah, will this have an impact on pistol braces? 100,000%. Anyway, we'll move on. In any event, ATF's argument cannot succeed on its own terms, right? Which I love. All right, we already got that. So if what ATF is saying is true, then every bump is a separate function of the trigger, and semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks are therefore not machine guns. By ATF's own logic, ATF resists the natural implication of its reasoning, insisting that the bumping motion is a function of the trigger only when it initiates, but not when it continues the firing sequence, which, right? But Congress did not write the statutory definition of a machine gun keyed to when a firing sequence begins and ends. 5845B asks only whether a weapon fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. Finally, the position that ATF and the dissent endorse is logically inconsistent. They reason that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger because a shooter need only pull the trigger and maintain forward pressure to activate continuous fire. If that is correct, however, then the same should be true for a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock. After all, as the dissent and ATF themselves acknowledge, a shooter manually bump firing a semi-automatic rifle can achieve continuous fire by holding his trigger finger stationary and maintaining forward pressure with his non-trigger hand. Yet they agree that a semi-automatic rifle without a bump stock fires only one shot each time the shooter pulls the trigger. Their argument is thus at odds with itself. And it really is, unless, and I'm going to play devil's advocate here, right? I'm all for pissing on the government. I think it's fun to do, right? But let's be real, right? Their argument was the government's argument is really like one of alchemy shape-shifting, right? They're saying that the trigger ledge, right, for like if I'm going to grant logic to the government, I think what they were saying is that the trigger ledge was the trigger, and that the pushing, right, initiates the sequence, and that from the shooter's perspective, they're holding on to the same thing. It is still at odds with itself, right? Because, well, is it self-acting or self-actuating, right? It's not. It might be self-acting, but it's not self-regulating and not self-actuating. So, like, anyway, right. I do agree that it's at odds with itself, but I do think the court is being slightly disingenuous to the argument, but in a way that I think is funnier and thus is absolutely true. We conclude that a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not a machine gun because it does not fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. B. A bump stock is not a machine gun for another reason. Even if a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock could fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, it would not do so automatically. 5845B asks whether a weapon shoots automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The statute thus specifies the precise action that must automatically cause the weapon to fire more than one shot. I like this part. I like this part we're getting to. Fire more than one shot. That action is a single function of the trigger. If something more than a single function of the trigger is required to fire multiple shots, the weapon does not satisfy the statutory definition. As Judge Henderson put it, the statutory definition of machine gun does not include a firearm that shoots more than one round automatically by a single pull of the trigger and then some. Right? And that was in the opinion below. And that's a pretty baller way to put it. Firing multiple shots using a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock requires more than a single function of the trigger. The shooter must also actively maintain just the right amount of forward pressure on the rifle's front grip with his non-trigger hand. Too much forward pressure and the rifle will not slide back far enough to release and reset the trigger, preventing the rifle from firing another shot. Too little pressure and the trigger will not bump the shooter's trigger finger with sufficient force to fire another shot. Without this ongoing manual input, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock will not fire multiple shots. Thus, firing multiple shots requires engaging the trigger one time, and then some. And then let's read this footnote. This looks like a spicy footnote. The dissent seemingly concedes this point, repeatedly recognizing that the shooter must both pull the trigger and maintain forward pressure on the front grip. So it's just, yeah. He just keeps quoting the different times that the dissent recognizes that. But again, I think the dissent's point is that it's from the perspective of the shooter, not from the perspective of the firearm, which is an argument. It's in fact one of the arguments of all time, but the fact that the usage of the term, and I'm going to be hyper legalistic here, the usage of the term function, I think refers to mechanical objectivity and not the perception of the shooter. ATF and the dissent counter that machine guns also require continuous manual input from the shooter. He must both engage the trigger and keep it pressed down to continue shooting. In their view, there is no meaningful difference between holding down the trigger of a traditional machine gun and maintaining forward pressure on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock. This argument ignores that Congress defined a machine gun by what happens automatically by a single function of the trigger. Simply pressing and holding the trigger down on a fully automatic rifle is not manually input in addition to a trigger's function, right? It is a continued function. It is a continued single function, rather. I think that is good lawyering. It is what causes the trigger to function in the first place. By contrast, pushing forward on the front grip of a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock is not part of functioning the trigger. After all, pushing on the front grip will not cause the weapon to fire unless the shooter also engages the trigger with his other hand. Thus, while a fully automatic rifle fires multiple rounds automatically by a single function of the trigger, a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock can achieve the same results only by a single function of the trigger and then some. Moreover, a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock is indistinguishable from another weapon that ATF concedes cannot fire multiple shots automatically, the Ithaca Model 37 shotgun. All right, here, let's get into this, because this is interesting. Why they chose the Ithaca 37, I don't know. Probably because that was like brought up by one of the lawyers or in one of the briefs or something. But it's like, that's not the shotgun that you think of when you think of slam firing, right? You think of that Winchester 1897. But am I wrong here? Chat, let me know. Am I stupid? For this reason, not for other reasons. Right? Like, do you think of the Ithaca 37 when it comes to slam firing? Ivan says they don't even know it well. Okay, yeah. I didn't know the Ithaca could slam fire, and I own one. Nitre says, yes, I think of the Ithaca because it's cheaper and I can afford it. But yeah, no, most people agree. Yeah, everyone thinks of the Winchesters. Whatever. All right, yeah, so we're right, chat, except for the 3 or 4 of you that say you think of 37s. I think you think of 37s because you're dumb. There's something wrong with you. Anyway, the Model 37 allows the user to slam fire. That is, fire multiple shots by holding down the trigger while operating the shotgun's pump action. Each pump ejects the spent cartridge and loads a new one into the chamber. If the shooter is holding down the trigger, the new cartridge will fire as soon as it is loaded. According to ATF, the Model 37 fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, but it does not do so automatically because the trigger must manually operate the pump action with his non-trigger hand. That logic mandates the same result here. Maintaining the proper amount of forward pressure on the front grip of a bump stock equipped rifle is no less additional input than is operating the pump on a Model 37. ATF responds that a shooter is less physically involved with operating a bump stock equipped rifle than operating the Model 37's pump action. Once the shooter pulls the rifle's trigger a single time, the bump stock harnesses the firearm's recoil energy in a continuous back and forth cycle that allows the shooter to attain continuous firing. But even if one aspect of a weapon's operation could be seen as automatic, that would not mean that the weapon shoots automatically more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. So again, keeping it all in the context of the statutory definition. After all, many weapons have some automatic features. It's like all of them. Well, not all of them. Like most of them made today. For example, semi-automatic rifles eject the spent cartridge from the firearms chamber and load a new one in its place without any input from the shooter. A semi-automatic rifle is therefore automatic in the general sense that it performs some operations that would otherwise need to be completed by hand. But as all agree, a semi-automatic rifle cannot fire more than one shot automatically by a single function of the trigger because the shooter must do more than simply engage the trigger one time. The same is true of a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock. Thus, even if a semi-automatic rifle could fire more than one shot by a single function of the trigger, it would not do so automatically. So let's talk about the slam fire issue. I wish I could handle guns on the live stream, but ATF would get, not ATF, YouTube would get big deluxe angry. If I put my paws on a gun. But the thing about slam fire guns is that if they were gas operated or recoil operated, they would function as automatic. Like they have a safety sear is how it works. They don't release the hammer until the right time, which is the same thing as an AR-15 auto sear. The reason I think that this is disingenuous on both parts, like the ATF saying no, that's not automatic because you have to do manual input. But the statutory definition has another part though. It says without manual reloading. And when you're jerking on a pumper gun, you're doing the loading. Like that's what separates an automatic firearm from the rest. And I mean, like, look at the like there's a lot of old patents, right? Very early on. Like what was the Browning Auto 5? It's the Browning automatic shotgun. What was the 1911? It's the Colt automatic pistol, right? The thing that these things were doing was automatically reloading themselves. That was like the real cool thing, right? Because in the age of repeaters, you still had to jerk on your pumper guns. So I think that's the obvious reason why the slamfire shotguns don't apply. Is the statute, like the one part of the statute that they're not focusing on without manual reloading, but it's funny. JD says that he got told not to rapid fire after jelking on his pumper gun. Anyway, moving on. Abandoning the text. ATF and the dissent attempt to shore up their position by relying on the presumption against ineffectiveness. That presumption weighs against interpretations of a statute that would render the law in great measure nugatory and enable offenders to elude its provisions in the most easy manner. It is a modest corollary to the common sense proposition that Congress presumably does not enact useless laws. I disagree. But, in ATF's view, Congress restricted machine guns because they eliminated the manual movements that a sugar would other blah, blah, blah. We already covered that in the thing. So ATF reasons, concluding that bump stocks are lawful simply because the trigger moves back and forth, would exalt artifice above reality and enable evasion of the federal machine gun ban. The dissent endorses a similar view. The presumption against ineffectiveness cannot do the work that ATF and the dissent ask of it. A law is not useless merely because it draws a line more narrowly than one of its conceivable statutory purposes might suggest. Interpreting 5845B to exclude semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks comes nowhere close to making it useless. Under our reading, 5845B still regulates all traditional machine guns. The fact that it does not capture other weapons capable of a high rate of fire plainly does not render the law useless. Moreover, it is difficult to understand how ATF can plausibly argue otherwise, given that its consistent position for almost a decade in numerous separate decisions was that 5845B does not capture semi-automatic rifles equipped with bump stocks. Curiously, the dissent relegates ATF's about face to a footnote, instead pointing it to its classification of other devices. And I actually own ATF's first about face, the Spitfire semi-automatic carbine. I will be doing a video on that because it is interesting. The dissent's additional argument for applying the presumption against ineffectiveness fails on its own terms. To argue that our interpretation makes 5844B far less effective, the dissent highlights that a shooter with a bump stock equipped rifle can achieve a rate of fire that rivals traditional machine guns. But the dissent elsewhere acknowledges that a shooter can do the same with an unmodified semi-automatic rifle using the manual bump firing technique. The dissent thus fails to prove that our reading makes 5845B far less effective, much less ineffective, as is required to invoke the presumption. In any event, Congress could have linked the definition of machine gun to a weapons ready fire, as the dissent would prefer. But it instead enacted a statute that turns on whether a weapon can fire more than one shot automatically by a single function of the trigger. And it is never our job to rewrite statutory text under the banner of speculation about what Congress might have done. That's a big one. That's a big quote. I like that quote, and I like that they're using it here in an ATF interpretation case. That'll help later. For the foregoing reasons, we affirm the judgment of the Court of Appeals. All right. It is so ordered. It is so ordered. All right. So next up, we'll look at the concur and the the concurrence and the dissenti. I'm going to take a little stretch, and I'm going to read the stupor chats that happened. Because I like it when you guys give the money. Oh, yeah. Mark Liff's things. That was fun. I think I already read that. I'm having a field day with the ATF's reasoning in court. Whoa, it's true. Scott Lipp sent $9.99 without comment. I appreciate that. Scott Lipp then added, if police /FBI/ATF commonly used machine guns aren't machine guns in common use. Well, so the common use question, right, is interesting because, one, that's not the actual test, and thank God it's not the actual test, because it would mean that, any rare gun was not constitutionally protected. But remember that it says that when the court is referred to common use, it says common use for lawful purposes. And I don't think that what the police, FBI, and ATF do is very lawful. I think they generally are thugs. And instead of, they could spend their thug time effectively and for the benefit of the community, perhaps by thug shaking. But instead they just harass people and violate our rights. So I don't know if the police and FBI and ATF's use of machine gun qualifies as a common use for lawful purposes. I think it's a criminal enterprise. 01 Sean 01 said, do you think that so he's talking about back with the first brief that we did, which endorsed this opinion, where those trigger images came from. He's saying, do you think they think you ruined everything because they do not actually want to restore gun rights? Are they just trying to make money fighting for 2A rights as long as possible? Good content, by the way. So no, I don't think that. I don't think that these people I think that there might be like a slight undertone of, we don't want to push too hard because if we actually win, it'll be hard to make money, right? Which they saw during the Trump slump, like at the beginning, right, until the bump stock thing, which then, right, shot up donations. So I do think that there's a tinge of that, right, which is why their lawsuits, even at a prime opportune moment, don't ever implicate the Second Amendment. Right, and when they do nominally, they only attack at the little fringes, with like a little cat, and they just go at the little fringes. Are they just trying to make money, quoth, fighting for 2A rights as long as possible? That's kind of obvious, dude. Like, look at, but look, this goes for any organization. Look at the organization, look at their Form 990s, see who's getting paid the most money, see if those people have any connection to firearms. They usually don't. Most of the large gun rights groups were founded by a person. Well, some of them were founded by a person who really cared, and then as they went on, the purpose of the group became to ensure that they and their friends received fat salaries, subsidized by blue-collar working people who care about their rights, and then sitting on their hands, which makes me really sick, and that's why I couldn't work at those places anymore, because it made me want to vomit. Nitrace, his 20th super chat. This guy's loaded, by the way. I honestly glad to see this one, and seeing SCOTUS get real specific about function and the or something else stuff. Thank you, Nitrace. Very cool. Johannes says, how will this affect Nintendo Power Glove with motors that auto-move the shooter's fingy to make the bang switch go faster? Well, so we're at the end of the majority, right? So we can kind of do some speculation now. The majority opinion is the only controlling part. Here's the thing. When they ruled on the Power Glove thing, the idea was that the trigger actually became the button, right? The button on the inside of the glove. How the Power Glove worked was, it was a glove that had a motor with basically a vibratory motor, where it just has an offset on the end of a shaft, and so as it spins, it would bump the trigger, and you put your finger in, you'd have a little micro switch that you'd initiate, and then the motor would bump off the trigger. The question is, when do you actually change what the trigger is? Because with the bump stock, you're still just flatly interfacing with the firearm trigger. So this logic, though, is grounded in terms of what the trigger is, right? And look at all that time that was spent on the definitions of the trigger. It's the thing that sets the action in motion. I'm really not sure. I think that there's a non-insane argument both ways. Is the unsatisfying answer that I would give you, but I'd have to really think about it more. If you want me to think about it more, send me like $50, okay? I'm just kidding. I'm not thinking about it more. All right, cool. So let us move on now to the concurrence. Just did a time warp. Actually, no. So before we read the concurrence, let's talk about the. So what are the ones that we want to talk about most? Right, the FRT, the FRT, what are the other ones? Oh, the binary and the super safe. So here's the thing. The decision here, it's not precedential in terms of other devices. It's precedential in terms of what the statute means. And so what it's basically telling us is that there's kind of three elements to the definition. It has to fire automatically by self-acting, right, by a single function of the trigger. And that's from the perspective of the firearm, not from the perspective of the shooter. And let's talk about Florida, because that's an interesting one. It's an interesting one, and it's not as clear as you might think after that, all right? So, binary triggers. Some people were telling me that, oh, well, they're saying it's a full what they're saying is it's a full arc of the trigger. They don't actually say that, right? In all those definitions of trigger and function, it's the latch that sets it off. So I don't think this says that a binary is a machine gun. I think there's a very rational argument to make that when you pull a binary, you are triggering an action, and when you release it, that is a separate mechanical input and a separate mechanical function that releases another component. And if you look at the way a binary trigger works, it does have a separate, effectively, sear surface. It's a disconnector surface that becomes a sear surface when the binary is actuated. That you have to press off to move. So I think the binary trigger falls into the and something more, right? Because the statute says automatically by a single function of the trigger, not automatically by a single function of the trigger and something more. That's where I think I would put it, but it's not the cleanest. It doesn't cleanly fit into this thing, right? So let's think about the FRT, because the FRT does put itself off of a sear every time, right? And you have to click it back. It boops you off. Similarly to the bump stock, putting too little pressure or too much pressure causes it not to function. It's very similar. So the question is, does it... I think it's less close than... Or I think it's like further from obvious than the binary. I think my current gut is that an FRT is plus something more. It's my current gut. Because it isn't just... Right, this case was very clear about a single function, right? That there's a difference between holding the trigger and birtling on something, right? Or, a single function plus more. I think that the way a force reset trigger works is something more. Pot Creme, do you agree? All right. And then, is there... Oh, and then the Florida issue. So, yeah, Florida has its own bump stock ban. But have you ever read it? Many lawyers are... Well, many of the, like, 3 gun lawyers in Florida are of the opinion that that law doesn't actually ban anything. Because the text of the law, the way it defines a bump stock, is it something that increases the mechanical rate of fire, which a bump stock doesn't do, and which this Supreme Court case has recognized that it doesn't do. So I don't think the Florida bump stock ban actually bans anything. I think it's too vague. But if you want to roll the dice with the FDLE, be my guest. Is there anything else we should speculate on before we go? I'll be watching for that, and I'll read the last couple super chats. Just looking for more speculation. Oh, and the super safety. I don't think of that what you will. Potentially criminal. I love you very much. I'm not reading that. But thank you for I can refund you if you need me to. The Poorman's machine gun says the original Aikens accelerator automatically bump fired using counteracting spring tension. Yes, that's true. Thank you so much for the very generous super chat. Jim tells you, says, while you are having the aforementioned field day, if you don't find some ways to include all of Biden's comment about us needing F-15s to resist tyranny, I'll be very disappointed in your trolling abilities. Brigo Burr. I mean, that's like, it's really stupid, right? Because, there's a very edgy way to respond to that. And there's a big difference between, matters at home and, foreign conflicts that the government, is used to dealing with. Let's just say domestic conflicts are just really, really horrible. And that's because the guy who flies the F-15 has a house. So you don't get to just say, oh, we have the F-15, right? It's like, all right, okay. It's just horrible. And to suggest that you would use bombs against your own people, that's brilliant. It's just such a funny world we live in. We've really lost the plot, haven't we? Like the fact that we're having to have that discussion and make that obvious counterpoint to the and what's more macabre, right? Like noting the fact that the operators of the military heavy equipment have homes, versus, is that a really grim, macabre, and evil thing to say? Versus, the head of our government saying, "Oh, we'll just turn you into glass," and that's okay, almost nobody, especially no progressives had. Well, hyper progressive didn't have any issue with that because they're programmed. They have a different set of programming. Scott Lip, would it make a good lawsuit to claim that since the police /ATF/FBI commonly use machine guns made after 1986 that they are in common use? I just addressed that. Remember, common lawful use for lawful purposes, and you're talking about cops. Those are criminal enterprises. They are subject to RICO actions. Chase Farmer, I've recently reached out to ask if you're taking more cases. Can you let me know what information you'd like me to send you to the email you provided? Should I summarize the case, send the full discovery? Sure. That's fine. Just quick summary is best to start with. J Spike said Sneed. Fair Frozen says, have jelking bump stick stock when, Matt? Need one made for Vicar Draco. That's funny. If the Gov... Jeb Reggie, who is a cute anime girl, according to the profile picture. If the Gov was willing to bomb countries overseas, imagine what they would do if they felt their existence threatened by domestic opposition. I think they would pee and also find out that there's not that many people who like once you start saying, oh yeah, your cousin's town, just blow it up. I think you start finding the number of like high functioning alcoholic 23-year-olds that are willing to do what you say goes down. Yeah, and then GODKYT regarding, domestic conflict, you don't even have to really look at where the pilots live. They don't drill and refine jet fuel on the Air Force Base. Yeah. So that all to say is it's just terrible, and the government shouldn't be threatening us like that. It's mean. All right, so let's move on to the concurrence. Justice Alito concurrence. I join the opinion of the court because there is simply no other way to read the statutory language. Then can be little doubt that the Congress that enacted 5845B would not have seen any material difference between a machine gun. There can be little doubt that the Congress that enacted 5845B would not have seen any material difference between a machine gun and a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock, but the statutory text is clear and we must follow it. And need I remind you that the Congress that enacted 5845B was specifically targeting a single gun so that they could prosecute booze runners? Like, horrible shooting spree in Las Vegas did not change the statutory text for its meaning. That event demonstrated that a semi-automatic rifle with a bump stock can have the same lethal effect as a machine gun, and it thus strengthened the case for amending 5845B. But an event that highlights the need to amend a law does not itself change the law's meaning. There's a simple remedy for the disparate treatment of bump stocks and machine guns. Congress can amend the law, and perhaps would have done so already if ATF had stuck with its earlier interpretation. Now that the situation is clear, Congress can act. Did anyone join this? Let's check, because I hope no one joined that weak trash. Yeah, no, everyone was like, yeah, Alito, go ahead, sit in your chair, sit in your little chair. The dissenting opinion. I'm gonna be real with y'all. I don't want to read this right now. It's as long as the main opinion, and the stream's already gone on a pretty long time, and I've got a couple other things I've got to do. So we can come back and read the dissent later. Is that Kubi with you guys? I mean, I do think it'll be good for us to read and kind of like give it Sotomayor wrote it. Yeah. So, yeah, it's long, and it's. I want to do something else. Right, read the duck part. Okay, fine. I'll read the duck part of the dissent. Duck. Okay, we'll just read the. All right, we'll get it started and we'll see if it's how it's going. All right. Sotomayor, with whom Justice Kagan and Justice Jackson joined dissenting. On October 1, 2017, a shooter opened fire from a hotel room overlooking an outdoor concert in Las Vegas, Nevada, in what would become the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Within a matter of minutes, using several hundred rounds of ammunition, the shooter killed 58 people and wounded over 500. He did so by affixing... I like how the two opinions disagree on how many people were killed. That's really funny. He did so by affixing bump stocks to commonly available semi-automatic rifles. These simple devices harness a rifle's recoil energy to slide the rifle back and forth, repeatedly bump the shooter's stationary trigger finger, create rapid fire. All the shooter had to do was pull the trigger and press the gun forward. The bump stock did the rest. It's kind of like how with other guns, all you have to do is pull the trigger and then do it again, and the gun does the rest. Congress has sharply restricted civilian ownership of machine guns since 1934. Not quite true. Federal law defines a machine gun as a weapon which can shoot automatically more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. Shortly after the Las Vegas massacre, the Trump administration, with a widespread bipartisan support, banned bump stocks as machine guns under the statute. I don't think you can bipartisan support an administrative action. Stupid. I don't think that's how that works. Today, the court puts bump stocks back in civilian hands it's taking them out of the police hands. To do so, it casts aside Congress's definition of machine gun and seizes upon one that is inconsistent with the ordinary meaning of the statutory text and unsupported by context or purpose. When I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, I call that bird a duck. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle fires more than one shot without manual reloading by a single function of the trigger. Because I, like Congress, call that a machine gun, I respectfully dissent. That's Do you guys hear Honda time? There's just Honda time outside. Yeah, no, so this is ductualism is better than originalism or textualism because they just assert that that was not a VA, bro. They assert that that's what the statute says without reference to the statute. They're just like anyway, let's when I see a bird that walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck. Okay, what is a goose? You know, I mean, I've called a goose a duck before. Machine guns were originally developed in the 19th century as weapons of war. See the social history of the machine gun. What the? Smaller and lighter submachine guns were not commercially available until the 1920s. Although these weapons, why did an amicus brief talk? Although these weapons were originally marketed to law enforcement, they inevitably made it into the hands of gangsters. Gangsters like Al Capone used machine guns No, they used machine guns for the same reason that gang appreciated aesthetics surround stuff in modern modern gang culture. They appreciate things that are expensive and flashy. They like 5.7s with large magazines. The Thompson was the most expensive shit money could buy, so that's why they bought it. They didn't buy it because it was a good gun or that it did stuff. Yeah, although it was marketed to law enforcement. Doesn't that also mean something different? Because law enforcement is the main thing that we're supposed to look to for weapons we should choose for self-defense. Newspaper headlines across the country flashed gangsters use machine guns, machine gun used in bank holdup, and machine gun thugs kill postal employee. Yes, journalism was different back then. Congress responded in 1934 by sharply restricting civilian ownership of machine guns. The Senate report examining the 1934 Act emphasized that the gangster as a law violator must be deprived of his most dangerous weapon, the machine gun. Which is why the original act was focused entirely on pistols. You know, the gun that they actually used. While there is justification for permitting the citizen to keep a pistol or revolver for his own protection, there is no reason why anyone except a law officer should have a machine gun. Why would a law officer have the machine? I like when they cite stuff that is completely at odds with modern civil rights jurisprudence as thinking that it's some kind of an own. These early machine guns allowed a shooter to fire in a variety of ways. Some would fire continuously with a single pull of the trigger or push of a button. Noting that a Browning 1918 rifle fired 8 rounds in a second with one pull of the trigger. Yeah. Okay. Others, such as the famous Thompson submachine gun caliber 45, or Tommy gun, yeah, that's a model, would fire continuously only so long as the... They think that the Browning is a... This is just great. Whatever. Shooter could still fire single shots by pulling and releasing the trigger each time. See Test of Thompson submachine gun, 1921. Noting that the shooter of a Tommy gun can fire the contents of the magazine with a single prolonged pull or fire a single shot by merely releasing the trigger. The internal mechanisms of automatic fire weapons are also varied enormously, with many, such as the Tommy gun, relying principally on the recoil energy produced by each bullet's discharge to effectuate automatic fire. To account for these differences, Congress adopted a definition of machine gun that captured any weapon which shoots blah, blah, blah. The archetypical modern machine guns is the military standard issue M16 assault rifle, which is an AR-15, by the way. With an M16 in automatic mode, the shooter pulls the trigger once to achieve a fire rate of 700 to 950 rounds per minute. An internal mechanism automates the M16's continuous fire so that all the shooter has to do is keep backward pressure on the trigger, unlike a bump stock. If the shooter stops putting pressure on the trigger, the gun stops firing. Semi-automatic weapons are not machine guns under the statute. Take, for instance, an AR-15 style semi-automatic assault rifle, of which the M16 is the derivative. To rapidly fire an AR-15, a shooter must rapidly pull the trigger himself. It is semi-automatic because although the rifle automatically loads a new cartridge into each blah, blah, blah. To fire an M16 or AR-15 rifle, a person typically holds the grip next to the trigger with his firing hand. He stabilizes the weapon with the other hand on the... Like, they're talking about... He then raises the weapon so that the butt or stock of the gun rests against his shoulder. It lines up the sights to look down the gun and squeezes the trigger. A regular person with an AR-15 can achieve a fire rate of about 60 rounds per minute with one pull of the trigger per second. Yeah, it... If you pull the trigger once per second, you get 60 rounds per minute. That is correct. If I do the same on my Mac 11, it fires at 60 rounds per minute. A professional sports shooter can use the AR-15 to fire a rate at up to 180 rounds per minute, pulling the trigger 3 times per second, which is just made up by Giffords, by the way. And then also, fascinatingly, in these briefs, in the Giffords briefs, they're talking about effective fire rate, and so like including reloads. But when they're talking about machine guns and bump stock, they're talking about practical or like impractical. They're talking about like the extrapolated fire rate, like if it had unlimited rounds. So that's fine. It's apples to apples comparison. It's fine. A shooter can also manually bump an AR-15 to increase the rate of fire by using a belt loop or rubber band to hold his trigger finger in place and harness the... How do you use the rubber band? I've only ever done the belt loop. And harness the recoil from the first shot to fire the rifle continuously. To use a belt loop, he must hold the rifle low against his hip, put his finger in the trigger guard, and then... with his other hand, he then... I'm not going to read the instructions because I don't want YouTube to bite me. Even though this is a Supreme Court decision, by the way. The recoil from that shot pushes the rifle violently backward. If the shooter keeps pressing the rifle forward against the finger at his belt loop, blah, blah, blah. Shooter using this method, however, cannot shoot very precisely. He has neither the advantage of the sights to line up his shot, nor his shoulder to stabilize the recoil. A shooter can also use a rubber band or zip tie, a finger close to the... Whatever. If the shooter is strong and skilled enough physically to control the distance and direction of the rifle's significant recoil, the rifle will fire continuously. Strong and skilled enough. Only the strongest bumping chads in this chat. Right. So, this is like, it's manifestly absurd. And like, this also suggests that bump fire is okay because it's not as accurate, which is not anywhere in the statute and is also kind of an insane thing to be pushing for jurisprudentially. Yeah. Bump stock automates and stabilizes the bump firing process. It replaces the rifle standard stock, which is the part held against the... Like, I love how many times, it's like 5 times we've described what a stock is. Like, what is the deal with this country? A bump stock, unlike a standard stock, allows a rifle's upper assembly to slide back and forth in the stock upper assembly. It's the whole damn gun, you idiot. It also typically includes a finger rest on which the shooter can place his finger while shooting, and a receiver module that guides and regulates the weapon's recoil. To fire a semi-automatic rifle equipped with a bump stock, the shooter either pulls the trigger or slides the gun forward in the bump stock, which presses the trigger into his trigger finger. As long as the shooter keeps his trigger finger on the finger rest and maintains constant forward pressure on the rifle's barrel or front grip, the weapon will fire continuously. A rifle equipped with a bump stock can fire at a rate between 400 and 800 rounds per minute, which again, that's a theoretical rate of fire, not a practical rate of fire. A machine gun does not fire itself. The important question on the statute is how a person can fire it. See, this is where they're getting into the perspective thing, right? It's the perspective of the shooter. How does the shooter fire it? A weapon is a machine gun when a shooter can, 1, by a single function of the trigger, 2, shoot automatically more than one shot without manually reloading. I also like how they're the only ones that point out the manual reloading. The plain language of that definition refers most obviously to a rifle like an M16, where a single pull of the trigger provides continuous fire as long as the shooter maintains backward pressure on the gun. The definition of a machine gun also includes any part designed and intended for use in converting a weapon into a machine gun. That language naturally covers devices like bump stocks, which are not single parts, but rather a combination of parts. Stupid. Continuous fire as long as the shooter maintains forward pressure on the gun. This is not a hard case. All of the textual evidence points to the same interpretation. A bump stock equipped with semi-automatic rifle is a machine gun because 1, with a single pull of the trigger, the shooter can 2, fire continuous shots without any human input beyond maintaining forward pressure. See how we're like amending the statute a little bit as we go? Without any addition beyond the other stuff that you're doing. The majority looks to the internal mechanism that initiates fire rather than the human act of the shooter's initial pull to hold that a single function of the trigger means a reset of the trigger mechanisms. Its interpretation requires 6 diagrams and an animation to decipher the meaning of the statutory text, whereas your interpretation just doesn't make any sense. Then, shifting focus from the internal mechanism of the gun to the perspective of the shooter, the majority holds that continuous forward pressure is too much human input for bump stock-enabled continuous fire to be automatic. The majority's reading flies in the face of this court's standard tools of statutory interpretation. By casting aside the statute's ordinary meaning, both at the time of its enactment and today, the majority eviscerates Congress's regulation of machine guns and enables gun users and manufacturers to circumvent federal law. I just want to see if there's anything interesting. It's really... I'm going to keep going for like 15 more minutes. But this is like truly dumb. Then, shifting focus from the internal mechanism of the gun to the perspective of the shooter, the majority holds that a continuous forward pressure is too much human input for bump stock enabled continuous fire to fire automatic. The majority's reading flies in the face of this court's standard tools of statutory interpretation. By casting aside the statute's ordinary meaning, both at the time of its enactment and today, the majority eviscerates Congress's regulation of machine guns and enables gun users and manufacturers to circumvent federal law. Start with the phrase single function of the trigger. All the tools of statutory interpretation, including dictionary definitions, evidence of contemporaneous users, and this court's prior interpretation, point that the phrase meaning the initiation of the firing sequence by an act of the shooter, whether via push, pull, or switch of the firing mechanism. The majority nevertheless interprets function of the trigger as the mode of action by which the trigger activates the firing mechanism. You know the dictionary definition? Because in a bump stock equipped with semi-automatic rifle, the trigger's internal mechanisms must reset each time a weapon fires. The majority reads each reset as a new function. That reading fixates on a firearm's internal mechanics while ignoring the human act on the trigger referenced by the statute. Except it doesn't. The act doesn't reference the human act. If the act said pull, right, and we know why it didn't say pull, but if the act said something like that, that would be a human action, but it doesn't. All right. Consider the relevant dictionary definitions. In 1934, when Congress passed the NFA, function meant the mode of action by which something fulfills its purpose. That's a very specific one. A trigger meant the movable catch or lever that sets some force or mechanism in motion. The majority agrees with those definitions. It errs, however, by maintaining a myopic focus on a trigger's mechanics rather than on how a shooter uses a trigger to initiate fire. See, this is all about perspective. If you believe if you believe the statute was written from the perspective of the shooter, that's the only time that the dissent's argument makes any sense. And I'm not granting that it even makes sense in that context, but I just don't think it works that way. And everyone who's asking about the Florida law, I explained that a little bit earlier. I don't think that the Florida law actually bans anything, but this case has nothing to do with the Florida law. So moving on. Nothing about those definitions suggests that function of the trigger means the mechanism by which the trigger resets mechanically to fire a second shot, as opposed to the process that a pull of the trigger on a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle sets in motion. The most important function of a trigger is that what it enables a shooter to do, what force or mechanisms it sets in action. Single function of the trigger more naturally means... Okay, next paragraph, because that's just... And this is still... So we're quibbling over machine guns. Oh, this is interesting. They're the first people... This dissent here is the first to actually cite the hearings on the NFA, which are actually very good for our side. Evidence of contemporaneous usage overwhelmingly supports that interpretation. The term function of the trigger was proposed by the president of the NRA during the hearings of the National Firearms Act before the House. He understood the distinguishing feature of a machine gun to be that by a single pull of the trigger, the gun continues to fire. He emphasized that a firearm which is capable of firing more than one shot by a single pull of the trigger, single function of the trigger, is properly regarded as a machine gun. Distinguishing a machine gun from a pistol, the NRA president emphasized that for a pistol, you must release the trigger and pull it again. That's not what he was saying there. That was all about the NRA's acquiescence with the act if they took out the handgun ban, which was the most operative part of the act. He did not say the hammer slips off the disconnector just off the square point of the trigger rises the notch of the hammer, thereby resetting the trigger nice and stood in position. He instead emphasized the action of the shooter, who must right. But he didn't draft the law. We're talking about we're talking about a person who was there, talking about a late stage amendment to get them to drop their opposition for language that was already there. So that's idiotic. Predictably, the House and Senate reports reflect the same understanding of the phrase. The majority cannot disregard these statements as evidence of legislative purpose. They are, along with the contemporaneous dictionary definitions, some of the best evidence of contemporaneous understanding. Statements by legislators can assist. That's not a legislator, dude. That's a random dude that they brought in for a hearing to say, okay, what do we do to make you stop opposing it? And he was like, take out the handgun ban. And then they were like, oh, okay. And then they talked about some other crap for no reason. Indeed, at oral argument, when asked what evidence there was that as of 1934, the ordinary understanding of the phrase function of the trigger referred to the mechanics of the gun rather than the shooter's motion, respondent's lawyer could not point to a single piece of evidence that supports the majority's reading. He even agreed that Congress used the words function to ensure that the statute covered a wide variety of trigger mechanisms, including both push and pull triggers. In short, the majority disregards the unrefuted evidence that the text's ordinary and contemporaneous meaning, substituting instead its own understanding of the internal mechanics of an AR-15 without looking at the actions of the shooter. The court itself has also previously read the definition of machine gun in this exact statute to refer to the action of the shooter rather than the firing mechanism. In Staples, the court noted that a weapon which fires repeatedly with a single pull of the trigger is a machine gun as opposed to only with shot with just pull of the trigger, which is just a misquote of the statute in a case that was not about that, but was instead about mens rea. When a shooter initiates the firing sequence on a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle, he does so with a single function of the trigger. Under that term's ordinary meaning, just as the shooter of an M16 need only pull the trigger and maintain backward pressure on the trigger, shooter of a bump stock equipped AR-15 need only pull the trigger and maintain forward pressure on the gun. Both shooters pull the trigger only once to fire multiple shots. The only difference is that for an M16, the shooter's backward pressure makes the rifle fire continuously because of an internal mechanism. The curve lever on the trigger does not move. In a bump stock equipped AR-15, the mechanism for continuous fire is external. Shooters for the majority resist this ordinary understanding of the term function of the trigger with two technical arguments. First, it attempts to contrast the action required an M16 from that required to fire a bump stock AR-15. The M16 is an AR-15. We should move on. The majority tries to cabin a single function of the trigger to a single mechanism for activating continuous fire. A shooter can fire a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle in two ways. Blah, blah, blah. The logic, however, would also exclude a Tommy gun and an M16? Why? Both weapons can fire either automatically or semi-automatically. Oh, come on. That's so disingenuous. That's so disingenuous. Shooter using a Tommy gun in automatic mode could choose to fire single shots with distinct pulls of the trigger or continuous shots by maintaining constant backward pressure of the gun. An M16 user, like... Okay, this is just so stupid. I feel like I don't even have to explain that, why that's stupid. The majority's logic simply does not overcome the overwhelming textual and contextual evidence that single function of the trigger means a single action by the shooter to initiate a firing sequence, including pulling a trigger and pushing forward on a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle. Okay, so which takes less logical steps? Single function of the trigger means a single release of the mechanism the trigger is designed to trigger. Or single function of the trigger means a function of the trigger means a single action that then initiates a sequence which then includes other inputs. One of those doesn't sound singular. Whatever. Next, consider what makes a machine gun automatic. Put simply, a bump stock automates the process of firing more than one shot. Except it doesn't, because it's not self-acting or regulating. Let's see here. The majority attempts to analogize a bump stock to a Model 37 shotgun, which allows the user to fire multiple shots by holding down the trigger while operating the shotgun's pump action. Model 37 automates the second process, i.e. pulling the trigger for each shot, as long as the shooter maintains pressure on the trigger. Unlike a semi-automatic rifle, however, the Model 37 does not automate the first, as the shooter must manually operate the pump action with his non-trigger hand to eject the spent cart. Okay, so they couldn't read the statute all the way either. That's manual reloading. Next, consider what makes a machine gun automatic. A bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle is a machine gun because before automatic weapons, a person who wanted to fire multiple shots from a firearm had to do two things after pulling the trigger for the first time. Had to reload the gun, needed to pull the trigger again. Semi-automatic equipment like an AR-15 already automates the first process. They're so close. The bump stock automates the second. In a fully automatic rifle like an M16, that automation is internal. After a shooter, okay, so it's the same argument again. The majority nevertheless concludes that a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle requires too much human input to fire automatically because it requires the proper amount of forward pressure on the front grip to maintain continuous fire. Automatic, however, does not mean zero human input. And this is them getting back again to you're holding the trigger. This is the evasion thing. The majority arrogates Congress's policy-making role to itself by allowing bump stock users to circumvent Congress's ban on weapons that shoot rapidly by a single action of the shooter. You always have to be more suspicious of the side that amends the statute, like, slowly over the course of the case. The presumption against ineffectiveness assures that a text's manifest purpose is furthered, not hindered. For, like, okay, this is them just saying, oh, but if we can't do this, it's so bad. Oh, moreover, bump stocks are not the only devices that transform semi-automatic rifles into weapons capable of rapid fire with a single function of the trigger. Recognizing the creativity of gun owners and manufacturers, Congress wrote a statute loaded with anti-circumvention devices. The definition of machine gun captures... not more than 5, not single pull, not single. Following that definition, the Bureau of Alcohol Firearms and Explosive has reasonably classified many transformative devices other than bump stocks as machine guns. For instance, ATF has long classified force reset triggers as machine guns. What? Long? How long? See, brief for petitioners. Of fucking course they did. A force reset trigger includes a device that forces the trigger back downward after the shooter's initial pull, repeatedly pushing the curved lever against the shooter's stationary trigger finger. To a shooter, semi-automatic rifle equipped with the force reset trigger feels much like an M16. He must pull the trigger only once and then maintain pressure to achieve continuous fire. Gun owners themselves have also built motorized devices that will repeatedly pull a semi-automatic firearm's curved lever to enable continuous fire. ATF has classified such devices as machine guns since 1982. In 2003, the Fifth Circuit held that such a contraption qualified as a machine gun under the statute. An owner of a semi-automatic rifle had placed a fishing reel inside the weapon's trigger guard. When he pulled a switch behind the original trigger, the switch supplied power to a motor connected to a fishing reel. The motor caused the reel to rotate, and the rotation manipulated the curved lever, causing it to fire in rapid succession. ATF in 2017 also classified as a machine gun a wearable glove that a shooter could activate to initiate a mechanized piston moving back and forth, repeatedly pulling and releasing a semi-automatic rifle's curved lever. The majority tosses aside the presumption against ineffectiveness, claiming that its interpretation only draws a line more narrowly than one of Congress's conceivable statutory purposes might suggest, because the statute still regulates all traditional machine guns like M16s. Congress's ban on M16s, however, is far less effective if Congress didn't ban M16s. If a shooter can instead purchase a bump stock or construct a device that enables his AR-15 to fire at the same rate. The M16 is an AR-15. Even bump stock manufacturers recognize that they are exploiting a loophole, with one bragging on its website, bump fire stocks are the closest thing you can get to full auto and still be legal. Mid-South shooters bump fire systems. The majority creates a definition of the statute that bans only traditional machine guns, even though its definition renders Congress's clear intent readily evadable. Every member of the majority has previously emphasized that the best way to respect congressional intent is to adhere to the ordinary understanding of the terms Congress uses. This is a pile of their own quotes. Today, the majority forgets that principle and substitutes its own view of what constitutes a machine gun for Congress's. Congress's definition of machine gun encompasses bump stocks just as naturally as M16s. Just like a person can shoot automatically more than one shot with an M16 through a single function of a trigger if he maintains continuous backward pressure on the trigger, he can do the same with a bump stock equipped semi-automatic rifle if he maintains forward pressure on the gun. Today's decision to reject that ordinary understanding will have deadly consequences. The majority's artificially narrow definition hamstrings the government's efforts to keep machine guns from gunmen like the Las Vegas shooter. I respectfully dissent. Okay, that's it. So, yeah. I mean, this was just something, I guess. The logic of the dissent is, it's not as intensely absurd as we might have, like, been entertained by, but it's definitely not great. Right, the duck prudence, jurisdictional or judicial duck prudence is kind of stupid. So last couple chats and then we'll be done. My 98 from Rotten Eggs, my 98 Honda Civic with a custom body kit that looks like a Lambo, has a Lambo engine swapped in it and sounds like a Lambo. This is a Lambo. Yeah, that's duck prudence. And thank you for your first super chat. That's pretty cool, man. Richard Grubber, an hour behind listening at 1.25x speed, but what recourse do we have at undoing Scott's rate increasing device ban in Florida? Well, I don't think we have much. I don't think that the Florida Republicans will ever undo that law, but the issue is that the law didn't actually cover anything that it claimed to be covering because they don't actually increase the rate of fire of those devices. And the Supreme Court recognizes that here. Like, it doesn't actually increase the firearms rate of fire. So my argument would be that law didn't ever actually ban anything. I think you have to get into a pretty specific definition, like a pretty specific situation to meet the elements of that statute. So, but just like some people think it's illegal to sell binary triggers in Florida when it's clearly not. So, what will this case have any impact? No. Well, the impact would be the general availability of the devices. But it's going to take litigation is basically what it is. All right. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for coming. That was an exciting thing. It's going to be interesting to see how we use this going forward. I'm definitely going to be writing a couple of notices in some of the cases we have pending about this supplementary authority that is definitely important to some of the litigation we have going on. Also, I would just like to gloat again that the arguments and drawings that were attributed to FPF were done by me and Joe. And when we did that, we were screamed at by FPC's favorite $750 an hour lawyer who said we were ruining everything. And now FPC is taking credit for this when they have just republished our brief as an amicus brief in this one. Despite all that. So remember, the brief that got cited in the Supreme Court was actually written and produced by lawyers who conspicuously no longer work there. Okay, you got 2 more chats. Isn't saying they're exploiting a loophole, conceding that what they're doing is in fact legal? Yes. So loopholes are called, we lawyers call loopholes a different thing. We call it following the law. And the Redneck Ram says, well, I'm not going to be happy until it is affirmed that I can own a fully armed Gundam that includes anything, even a fully functioning energy-based burner rifle capable of sinking a colony. I think that if you get your hands on a Gundam, I don't think the law matters anymore. I think you can do what you want at that point. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you guys so much for all of your support. We'll be back to producing regular content now soon because I'm getting through the hump that I had the last few weeks. We've got a few filings that are due, and I was doing quite a bit of traveling, but yeah, thank you guys for coming. Thank you for your supports. Thank you for all of your generous donations for this chat. This is definitely a good step, and I think that ultimately we'll see some good things come out of this case. Maybe, most likely in the 5 to 10 year timeline, but maybe even sooner than that. So we'll just have to watch and see. You're my favorite. That's funny. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. See you next time.